Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you so much for joining me. I've got a very special and unusual episode for you today. I'm covering a topic I have only rarely covered, which is close encounters of the second kind. These are cases that affect the environment or the witness in some way. The title of today's episode is Weird and Freaky: 7 Crazy Close Encounters of the Second Kind. The 7 cases I have for you today come from all over the world, mostly Europe and the United States, including England, France, Germany, and in the US, California, Illinois, Iowa, and Wyoming. There are a lot of witnesses in this episode. We're talking 30, maybe 40 or more. And of course, the 4 major types of evidence that we often see associated with close encounters, including electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, landing traces, and physiological effects. These are some really unusual encounters, sort of on the bizarre end of the spectrum, which is why I chose them. I sometimes think that high strangeness in UFO encounters is an intentional aspect, sort of put forth by the UFO occupants to encourage us to think outside of the box, consider new paradigms, new ways of thinking. But let's just get to the cases and see what we have for you today. So the first case I'd like to cover today is very unusual. I call this one the glowing cloud. This one took place on May 7, 1980 in Anderson, California. It's a multiple in this case and really, really unusual. This very unusual case comes from researcher William M. Murphy Sr. of Redding, California. He worked with another researcher who actually requested anonymity, but this case first appeared in the June 1980 issue of the APRO Bulletin in an article titled CE3 in California. It's a multiple witness case, but the primary witness, the only adult, is Elizabeth Riley. It was around 9:50 p.m. on May 7, 1980. Elizabeth was with her 2 daughters, ages 15 and 16, and their friend. Elizabeth was driving at 30 miles per hour, heading south on Airport Road, about 1 mile north of the Sacramento River and adjacent to the Redding Airport. The radio was on, there was a truck right in front of them on the road, and this was a route that they had traveled many times. But this time something very weird and freaky happened. As they rounded a slight curve in the road, they saw what appeared to be a huge glowing cloud coming up out of the river and moving towards them. This glowing cloud was so big that it covered the whole horizon to the south, all the way in front of them. So Elizabeth's first thought was, "Dear God, has an atomic bomb gone off?" By this time, the cloud was totally in front of them, and Elizabeth realized that this, quote, cloud was actually moving against a strong north wind. It seemed to her as though this cloud rose out of the water. How she described it was like a huge closed fist, and then it opened up as they approached it. It was white at first, but then it turned yellow, and then had a slight green outline to it. The truck ahead of them on the road entered the cloud first, and Elizabeth felt as though her car was sort of drifting into the cloud. That's how she put it. Once they were inside this cloud, they felt as if the car was, quote, floating, and they seemed to black out for a moment. The radio went silent. The light inside the cloud was so bright that Elizabeth couldn't steer. She wondered if her headlights had gone out or if they were just overwhelmed by the extreme brightness within this cloud. She said it was the brightest light she had ever experienced in her entire life. Inside the cloud, they also all experienced an eerie silence. They were inside this thing for what seemed like just a few seconds when suddenly they, quote, came to, and they were about 150 feet from where they had entered this weird cloud and popped out on the other side of it. But none of them actually remembered exiting the cloud. They were just suddenly out of it. The radio immediately began playing again, and weirdly, the truck ahead of them was now gone. They also all experienced a strange feeling of peace, calm, and reverie. Now, very curious, naturally, about what had just happened, Elizabeth pulled a quick U-turn to look for the weird cloud, but there was no sign of it, which seemed impossible. She drove about 300 feet, and not seeing anything, she pulled another U-turn and continued the drive to their destination, which was a friend's house, not too far away. But all were now extremely thirsty, so they made a quick stop at a restaurant and got 4 sodas to go. As they continued the drive, Elizabeth's daughter's friend screamed and, quote, freaked out. She said she saw a wolfman-like face peering at her through the car window. When they arrived at their destination, they were now shocked to realize that it was 30 or even 40 minutes later than it should have been. This was immediately obvious to them, as the TV was playing a program that shouldn't have been on that soon. But none had any memory of what might have happened during this 30 or 40 minutes of missing time. Following this incident, all 4 of them experienced light sensitivity for 1 or 2 days afterward. It was bad enough that Elizabeth found reading impossible, and her light sensitivity persisted for a full week. And there were other weird after effects. Both of Elizabeth's daughters experienced nightmares that were very similar in detail, involving a wolfman-like face like their friend had seen. All 3 girls had minor puncture wounds surrounded by a really minor burn mark on their bodies that of course weren't there prior to the encounter. One girl found it behind her ear, another on her spine just above the waist, and the third had no pin mark but just a slight burn on her arm. All of these healed very rapidly. They did go to a doctor, and the doctor found them to be in good health, but he did note that the marks were, quote, unusual and unexplained. Following this incident, Elizabeth had her car checked and found that the battery was, quote, bone dry. Another weird effect, one of the daughters wore a wristwatch, and following this encounter, it was almost an hour slow. And the high strangeness continued. Shortly following the encounter, there was a very loud banging noise on the side of the house that woke everyone up in the house. They never were able to find out what caused that banging noise, but they did feel it was somehow related to their encounter. Over time, all these weird after effects stopped, and the family's life returned to normal. They are not interested in seeking hypnosis, but they do hope that one day their memories of the missing time will return naturally. So this case is essentially a sighting, which would be a close encounter of the first kind, but we can call it a close encounter of the second kind due to the fact that it did affect the witnesses in that they were very thirsty following the encounter. Also, there were the strange marks on their body. I suspect, due to the missing time, that this was probably an on-board encounter, which would of course make it a close encounter of the fourth kind. So very hard sometimes to categorize cases, and this one I think has a lot more information to it. I can understand why the witnesses did not want to go under hypnosis. So apparently what happened during this missing time, we don't know, and probably, yeah, an onboard encounter. Now let's move to the next one. This one is, again, really unusual. It's a very rare and special category of UFO encounters, one that I have a great interest in because I've studied them extensively. And I have more to say about it at the end of this segment, but let's get to it. I call this one Levitated by a UFO. This one occurred in 1971 outside the small village of Puget, France. This case comes from French investigator Jean-Louis Forest. The witness is anonymous, but he's an excellent witness, a technician employed in the arsenal of the French Navy at Toulon, France. Because of his job, he regularly made a long car journey between Nice and Toulon. It was one night in 1971, around 1:30 a.m., he was driving his Citroën vehicle from Nice to Toulon along National Highway 97. He had just exited the town of Puget and was heading toward Cours and was listening to the radio, when suddenly the radio mysteriously filled with static and then completely died. Thinking it had broken, he just turned it off. He was now on a straightaway just over 1 mile north of the Cours military airfield. There were no other cars around him, though generally this highway is pretty busy. And this is when he saw a large glowing orange sphere ahead of him above the road. Now, being near an airfield, he at first assumed that there must be some kind of an Air Force night exercise taking place. But then, weirdly and mysteriously, his engine began to misfire, and he noticed that his car was slowing down. He put his foot on the accelerator, but still his car continued to slow down, and this, quote, orange ball grew larger and closer, until soon it was about 165 feet in front of him, right over the road. He wondered now if perhaps an aircraft was having trouble and was going to land on the road instead of on the runway. Now panicking, he slammed on the brakes, but they didn't seem to work, and it appeared to him now that his engine wasn't working at all. And he soon realized that he had bigger problems, because looking out of the windshield, he saw that his car was no longer on the road, but was actually levitating above it. This orange sphere was now about 50 to 65 feet ahead of him, and was illuminating the road below it and the interior of his car. He could clearly see that his car was not touching the road, it was anywhere from 10 to 20 feet above it, and at this point an eerie silence reigned over the environment. This happened for only moments when suddenly the orange light went out and the car now fell heavily onto the street. The witness said he felt, quote, groggy. After orienting himself and making sure he was uninjured, he exited the car and got a shock. He saw that the car was pretty badly damaged. The spare tire, which had been located under the hood, came loose from its moorings, burst the hood open, and was now lying on the street a short distance away. The driver's seat was collapsed, the back seat was twisted up, and the car itself was partially flattened to some degree and was now sitting at an angle to the road. Moments later, other cars appeared and stopped to help and ask the witness what happened, but the witness did not know what to tell them. This road at this point was perfectly straight, so there didn't seem any explanation for how this could have happened. Finally, he did get another driver to tow him, and he was able to get the car started and drove very slowly to his destination of Toulon. Arriving home, he got another tremendous shock, because it was now 6 a.m. Even taking into account the accident and the time it took him to get some help and his slow drive to his destination, he should have arrived no later than 3:30 a.m., which meant that he was missing about 3 hours of time. The weird part was, where was the witness for these 3 hours? Because if he was on the road, which again was fairly busy, other people should have seen him. But nobody saw his car, not in the air, nobody saw it drop to the street, nobody reported seeing the UFO. And as researcher Jean-Louis writes, then both the man and the car must have been taken off to somewhere else for several hours, after which someone has returned them and put them down there again. This is the only possible explanation. During his interview with the witness agreed with this, and he said that he has no memory of what happened during the missing 3 hours. The investigators suggested that the witness attempt regressive hypnosis, and at first the witness enthusiastically agreed. But as he continued to think about it, he became afraid of what he might remember, and he backed out. So what happened during the missing time remains a mystery. So here we have a sighting that clearly became something much more than a simple sighting, given that this UFO levitated this man's car off of the highway and resulted in missing time and some pretty severe damage to his vehicle. I have huge respect for J. Allen Hynek and his system of categorizing UFO encounters as close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, and so forth was really useful at the time. But how would you categorize a case like this? It does appear that he probably was taken on board. He pulled out of going under hypnosis, so we really don't know. But what's really fascinating to me about this case is I did a whole episode on what we call UFO car lift cases. So there's quite a few of them taking place all over the world. I didn't include this one because I didn't know about it, but this fits in very neatly with this very special and unique category of cases. So unusual. All right, moving along. This next case I call a shocking UFO. This one involves multiple witnesses, landing traces, animal reactions, physiological effects. It's very unusual. This one took place on December 21st, 1974, outside of Darmstadt, Illinois, also in New Athens, Illinois. It's actually a series of events, began with a simple sighting and escalated as this UFO apparently followed the witnesses home. This case first appeared in the May 1975 issue of Skylook under the title Illinois Youths Report Strange Effects. The encounter began around 11:30 p.m. on December 21st, 1974, as Kim Lloyd drove from Darmstadt, Illinois to New Athens. Along with her were her two friends, brothers, Jeff and Rodney Walta. They were about 4 miles west of Darmstadt. The night sky was suddenly illuminated by a mysterious bright light. Rodney was the first to see the object, and they all saw it. A brightly lit, disc-shaped craft which was descending lower and lower. All three of them watched as this craft continued to descend. They estimated that it was about 30 feet in diameter, with rotating red and yellow lights around the edge of the saucer and portholes around the dome. Two bluish antennae came out of either side of the dome. The object continued to descend, finally disappearing behind the trees about 1,000 feet off to the side of the road. Now convinced that this craft had landed, the witnesses began to crisscross the area on every road near where they had seen this craft come down. But after about 40 minutes of searching and finding no trace of it, they continued on their way to New Athens. Reaching their destination, they now convinced some of their friends to return to the site, and they searched again for this craft. Unfortunately, their friends became bored and left, but Kim, Rodney, and Jeff remained. They pulled off at an intersection facing north with the Darmstadt Road in front of them. And their patience was rewarded when around 4 a.m., now of course December 22nd, they saw a star-like light appear, which began gyrating, hopping around, then descending and sending down beams of light. They said it changed colors from white to green and red, and then leveled off about 50 feet above the trees, and they estimate 1 mile away. It started to move closer, sending down this beam of light which became kind of broken, never quite reaching the ground. Kim and the other two then drove west on Darmstadt Road towards Route 13, at which point the object changed course and appeared to follow them. The object now moved closer, close enough that they could see it was sort of pie-shaped, with a bottom row of yellow lights and an upper row of red lights. As the three witnesses got close to Route 13, they saw that this object was hovering over what appeared to be a sort of landed, cylindrical-shaped object on the ground. And this object on the ground was pulsating with an orange glow on the front half and a green glow on the back half. But they continued driving and went north on Route 13 and lost sight of these objects. They soon arrived at Rodney Walta's home, and this is when things started to get really weird. Because Rodney said that he felt certain that the object was going to appear over their house, that it was following them home. And sure enough, shortly later, the area around the house became mysteriously illuminated with a very bright light. Looking out the windows, they now saw that their dogs were lying on the ground as if mesmerized, which is totally contrary to their behavior, as they were very excitable dogs who barked at anything. Now Rodney says he then heard strange noises on the roof of the house and in the basement. The others in the house weren't sure if they heard this, but everyone in the house certainly experienced what happened next. Because suddenly, and without any warning, a tremendous electrical shock swept through the house. All 5 members of the household felt this shock, and in fact one of the children in the house, 5-year-old Susie, was knocked to the floor. Rodney immediately ran to the window, and he now saw the bottom side of the UFO moving away from the house and disappearing. He was the only one who saw this. Now 3 years later, after contacting researchers, Rodney Walta returned to the area where they had seen this UFO landing with investigator W.J. Mills. And again they searched the area, And this is when Rodney pointed out a clearing where he thought the craft may have come down. The investigator, W.J. Mills, searched this area and found, quote, tracks I cannot identify. He said that the tracks were similar to a paw or hoof marks, but different. Despite his own considerable experience with hunting, he couldn't match them to any known creature. He was convinced that these tracks were bipedal. They were about 5 inches wide and 8 inches long with visible toes. But if that wasn't weird enough, the tracks began and ended abruptly. So perhaps there were humanoids, but nobody saw them. So there you go. It's another one of those cases that kind of just make you go, always raising more questions than it answers. But with so many witnesses and physiological evidence, animal reactions, and apparent footprints, it's really hard to deny this case and explain it away as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, or mental illness, as our governments would have us believe. It's so disingenuous because they put forth these explanations knowing full well the validity of the UFO phenomenon. So yeah, another case that provides another piece to this enormous jigsaw puzzle that we call the UFO phenomenon. Moving along to another very unusual case, one of my favorite in this compilation. I call this one, Friends, I Love You. This is a single witness case. It occurred in the fall of 1976 in Yellowstone National Park, actually, in Norris Geyser Basin in Wyoming. I consider this one a bit of a cautionary tale for people who are going to try to initiate a close encounter. In other words, do a CE5, a close encounter of the fifth kind. Sort of be careful what you ask for, because that's what occurred in this case. And I think the witness got a little bit more than he bargained for. This case appeared in the March 1980 issue of the APRO Bulletin in an article titled, Wyoming, Another Abduction? They apparently got the case from the Jackson Hole News of Laramie, Wyoming, in a December 12, 1979 issue containing the article, quote, Local Man Shares UFO Experiences. This is a very unusual case. Again, technically a CE5 case, a human-initiated encounter, and a cautionary tale with the well-known maxim, be careful what you wish for. The witness is Woody Holston. He had read a book titled Flying Saucers UFO Reports and became interested in making contact with ETs and hearing about strange lights seen in the Norris Geyser Basin in north-central Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. He decided to go there to try to make contact. This location is halfway between Mammoth Hot Springs and Old Faithful and contains almost 3 miles of boardwalks winding through the hot springs, and actually contains the world's tallest active geyser called Steamboat Geyser. It sits at the intersection of 3 major seismic faults where there are large shifting underground water reservoirs. So Woody went to this location multiple times throughout the fall of 1976, hoping to make contact. Then, one evening around sunset, he arrived at the spot and used his favorite method to initiate contact. He had a bright flashlight, which he had plugged into his Mustang, and began flashing out the message, Friends, I love you, in Morse code, up into the sky. Now, on prior occasions, he had flashed this same message up to 100 times, but received no response. But on this evening, he had just started when suddenly 2 UFOs showed up. And I'll just quote Woody directly. As he says, one of them went from the east to the west, and the other went north-south, sort of in orbit. They were quite visible because they were so big, and they had that aluminum cover that would reflect the sun's rays. The first one was a cylindrical thing, kind of a disc. The big one came in, and it was at least as big as a Safeway store, and it had a formation of some lights around an edge and over the right-hand side. Now, per Woody, the larger object had a weird indentation on the side, kind of like a doorway, and he quickly snapped a few photographs. And this is when things started to get really weird. As Woody says, I think I looked at it for probably 2 or 3 minutes before I fainted. The next thing he knew, he was waking up sometime later, he's not sure how long, and he stumbled into his car. And as Woody says, I curled up under the steering wheel. That's the last I can remember. I was semi-conscious, but not really. I could feel the car rattling, fluttering from my body, pulsations. I know that my teeth chattered so hard that my jaws were sore all the way to the top of my head. I wish I had a running account of anything that happened when I was in the car. God, I wish I knew. You get so scared that you're sick. You go crazy. You don't remember too much. Now, when Woody finally regained his bearings, he drove home, and it was then that he realized his watch was now 10 hours slow. The encounter affected him very profoundly. He began having nightmares about the incident. He did try to talk about it, but found that when he did, he would completely freak out. As Woody says, I was afraid to talk about it, because every time I did, I'd start coming apart. The thing about it that hurt me more than anything, I think, was I thought I was insane, that I'd gone crazy. I never made a big thing about it because I was afraid to. Maybe whatever this intelligence is might not want to be exposed. They may have tabulated me so that they know where I am all the time. Now the weirdest effect was yet to come, because Woody feels like the encounter somehow improved his health and actually slowed down his aging process. As Woody says, I've got more hair now than I did then. I think I'm being kept for some reason. I feel better now than I did when I was 30. Now he still believes he is in contact with the ETs, because about 3 years later, in the early dawn hours on October 10, 1979, he was jogging across the local Safeway parking lot when he saw a bright point of light zip across the sky at fantastic speed. And it was amazingly synchronistic how he saw this object, because as Woody says, I don't know what the hell made me look straight up into the air. Maybe they sent me a brainwave of some kind that made me look up. Now Woody is unsure exactly who he made contact with, whether it's ETs or perhaps something else. All he knows for sure is that his encounter did happen. As Woody says, I think it's God's angels and could possibly have a lot of answers. I don't think a person can really doubt it. If you do, you're naive. I don't think that we should be so naive to think that we're the only beings in the universe that would be capable of movement. What an amazing case that is. It just goes to show that CE5s do work, but yeah, you might be careful because it could lead to much more than a simple sighting. As we see, this gentleman had missing time. It affected him very profoundly, psychologically and apparently physically. How interesting is it that he says that this encounter affected him physically in a very beneficial way? He believes it slowed down his aging process. I have heard that in a few other cases. So this appears to be what I would call a healing encounter. Definitely very traumatic for him, but ultimately benevolent and a really, really unusual case. All right, now let's move to the next case, which I call I Was Petrified. This one is amazing because it's a multiple witness case, although there is one primary witness who had a much closer encounter than the others around her. This one occurred on February 11, 1980 in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And yeah, this one has some really amazing physiological effects that are frankly quite concerning. This next case first appeared in the February 14, 1980 issue of the Omaha, Nebraska Morning World Herald newspaper in an article by staff writer Michael Kelly. It was titled, quote, Eerie Orange Lights Spook Women. It was later presented in the July-August 1980 issue of the International UFO Journal in an article called Possible Abduction in Iowa. This case was investigated by researcher Alan Hendry, and it also appeared in the MUFON Journal under the title Another Time-Lapse Case. So it did get quite a bit of publicity. And you can see why, because this case involves 8 women, but there is one primary witness who I'll call Susan, as she has requested total anonymity. Her friends describe Susan as, quote, extremely level-headed. Now, every 2 weeks, these 8 women meet at one of their homes to play bridge. On February 11, 1980, all 8 of them met at a home just south of Council Bluffs. Among these ladies were Marilyn Anderson, age 37, Rita Sobetsky, an unnamed nun, and 5 others, including, of course, the anonymous Susan. There was no alcohol at the party, just coffee and soda. The bridge game broke up at around 11:30 p.m. The woman whose home it was remained, of course, while the 7 others left in 2 separate cars. One car was driven by Marilyn Anderson and held 6 of the women, including Rita Sobetsky and the nun, and the other was driven by Susan, who was alone in the car. She followed the others some distance behind them, and both cars were driving northbound on County Road G66. Suddenly, without warning, Marilyn, Rita, and the other woman in the first car all noticed a cluster of 3 to 5 unusual-looking red and white lights to their left in the western sky. These looked much larger than the full moon, and as Marilyn says, no one could see a shape. I heard no noise. They estimated that these lights were about 200 to 300 feet above a small hill, about 1 city block away. Marilyn stopped the car so everyone could see this better, and she actually got out of the car, and as she did, the lights sped off to the southwest, so they were in view for no more than 10 seconds. As Marilyn says, it was almost like we were spotted, and zoom, away it went. Rita confirms this, as she says, it was standing still in the sky, and then it took off. All I could see was 3 or 4 square white lights and a flashing red light. So they're stopped there on the road, and Marilyn rushed over to Susan's car, which was still directly behind hers, and asked Susan if she had seen the UFO. Susan's reply was, "Seen what?" She hadn't seen anything. So Marilyn got back in the car, and the 6 women returned to their separate homes, chattering along the way about what they had seen. Meanwhile, Susan separated from them and headed up County Road G66. Susan drove by the Iowa School for the Deaf and reached Longview Loop at around 11:40 p.m. She specifically remembers looking at her watch as she passed the Manor housing development. She was now about 5 minutes from home, so she traveled east down Longview Loop, and coming up to a stop sign, her car mysteriously stalled and her lights and radio went out. She tried a few times vainly to start the car, but of course it wouldn't start, so she got out to check, and this is when another car approached. Susan jumped back into her car, and weirdly, this time she was able to restart the car. She drove another quarter mile. She was now alone on the road, and this is when she noticed a pinkish-orange light in the sky, and the car stalled again. It wouldn't start, so this time she stepped out of the car, and she could now see a very bright orange light source about 900 feet away to her left, sitting in a cornfield. And in fact, it was so bright, it hurt her eyes to look at it. And as Susan says, I was petrified, like a rock. I couldn't look into the light because it was too bright. It was brighter than a railroad flare, really bright. Very frightened, she jumped back into her car and locked the door, and at this point she blacked out. Waking up what seemed like moments later, her car was now turned sideways across the road, as if she had skidded on ice, though of course she had no memory of doing this. The orange light was still in the cornfield, and as Susan says, I don't know what happened. I can't even make up a story. I just don't know what happened after that. She started up her car with no problem and drove the short distance home. Rushing inside her home, she looked out her window, and she could still see the glow of the orange light off in the distance. And this was when she noticed that she had weird red blotches and redness on her face and hands. As Susan says, my face and hands were pink, like the color of a healed scar. And my face was blotchy, not raised, but pink, about the size of a thumbprint. My stomach was upset, I had diarrhea, I was sweating. If you have ever seen anyone in profound shock, it was me. I thought I was marred for life. Susan now took her temperature and discovered that she was actually running a fever of about 102 degrees. She saw that the redness coincided exactly with where her skin had been exposed to this really bright orange light, because as she had exited the car, she covered her face and arms with her coat, and only the exposed part of her face and hands were red. She didn't wake up her husband, but instead called her sister, and her sister advised her to go visit a doctor immediately. Susan declined. She checked the clock, and she was shocked to see that it was now 12 minutes past midnight. This meant that she was missing approximately a half hour of time. Susan was naturally unable to sleep that night, and she remained awake all night. By 4 a.m., the red blotches began to fade, and 20 minutes later, they were gone. The next morning, she did not go to the doctor, but she later heard about her friend's UFO sighting, and this elicited both surprise and concern. Her friend did convince her to speak to reporter Mike Kelly of the Morning World Herald, but after this, she refused to speak to anyone else about this event and does not want to talk about her encounter. Per Margaret, Susan wants to dismiss this strange experience as something mundane. I think you'll agree that's a truly remarkable case, and yeah, looks like an onboard encounter to me, given that this woman was so deeply affected physically, had missing time. I wonder about it. So many cases of people who are driving along a remote highway late at night, and this is when they have their encounter. What makes this case unusual is that there were two vehicles, and the group of people in the first car saw the UFO that apparently took this other lady, and she had a really very close encounter. So I can't blame her for not wanting to pursue it, for just dismissing it as an unusual event in her life that she really doesn't want to talk about, because I think this is a reaction a lot of witnesses have. It's when they're confronted with something that's completely out of their worldview, it's very difficult for them to process. But I do wonder what would have happened if she sort of faced this encounter head on, decided to go under hypnosis, probably would have remembered an onboard encounter. I'm, of course, speculating here, but given that there was missing time, I suspect that's what happened. All right, now let's move to the next case, which is very widely viewed and has all kinds of really unusual electromagnetic disturbances associated with it. This is essentially a UFO wave. I call this one, "There Is No Explanation." This occurred on March 12, 1982, though there were follow-up sightings in the days that followed, in Messel, Germany. I wanted to include this one not only because it was widely viewed and there were electromagnetic effects, but you don't get many cases out of Germany. Apparently, the press there, the media, is not super keen on covering this subject, so we don't get a lot of cases there, and this one was one that was so dramatic it simply could not be covered up or ignored. This case involves an undeniable and widely viewed series of close encounters of the second kind with some very interesting effects on the environment. It began on March 12, 1982. At 9 p.m., a 14-year-old girl by the name of Manuela Helm and her friend Sonja Bormann, age 15, were walking to their home in Messel, Germany, after a party. Suddenly, without warning, a huge glowing object appeared high in the sky and immediately swooped down over their heads. It came so low, it appeared to the girls that it almost hit the ground, but then it shot back up again. Immediately, it dove down towards them again. Naturally terrified and panic-stricken, the girls dashed to the nearby youth center and alerted Manuela's older brother, Werner Helm, age 17, and his friends, who were all at a dance party. While Werner and about 10 other young men ran out to see the UFO, which was still up in the sky, Manuela and Sonja, who were still terribly frightened, dashed to their own homes, banging on the front door, screaming to be let in. Manuela's mother said her daughter was as white as chalk and trembling all over. Her mother said that even 2 weeks later, Manuela refused to go outside at night, and she told researchers, "But if you talk to anybody about it, they look at you as though you are daft." Meanwhile, her older brother Werner Helm and his friends saw that this UFO was now hovering at a treetop level over a nearby sports field, lighting the area around it, quote, as bright as day. They described this object as 65 feet wide, an elongated oval with a transparent glowing cupola. The craft was sending down 4 beams, quote, like searchlights, which kept changing from green to blue and back again. The boys approached this object to about 130 feet away from it, close enough to hear a loud hum coming from the craft. They watched it for about 10 minutes, when suddenly it sent out a blue burst of light, followed by a kind of banging noise. They watched it for about 5 more minutes, and then, becoming concerned, fled back to the protection of the youth center and continued to watch as this UFO rose slowly upwards, gained speed, and took off. Now, there were a lot of other people seeing this. Another witness was 13-year-old Martin Steffes, who saw the craft and ran screaming hysterically into the house. His foster mother, Marguerite Gustafsson, and her husband ran outside and saw several spherical glowing objects high up in the sky flying back and forth overhead. So they immediately rushed inside and called the police. Police Chief Thomas Welland and his partner, Mr. Beam Hansen, were sent to the Gustafsson residence with the alert that, quote, a woman was seeing flashing lights. Now, they didn't believe in UFOs, and they really didn't expect to see anything. But no sooner had they arrived when Mr. Beam Hansen shouted out, "Man, stop the car! I see them too!" Police Chief Thomas Welland, to his amazement, now saw them as well, 5 UFOs. He said 4 of them were flashing lights, and 1 was shifting color from dark green to pale green. And as he says, we saw a yellow-green flying disc as large as a ball. Later, 4 additional white flying discs approached and stopped next to the first one. Because nobody will believe it at the station when we tell this, we called for 3 further patrol cars to come to Messel. So shortly later, the patrol cars arrived with a total of about 8 policemen. The other officers got out and arrived, and they were grinning and said, "Okay, where are your little green men?" Chief Welland pointed to the sky, and the other officers were no longer grinning because all of them could now see these objects. The closest, which looked as though it was about to land behind a row of trees bordering the Messel-Darmstadt highway. But instead of landing, it shot upwards, and as it did, all their police car radios began to crackle with static. And at the same time, the lights in the houses all around the area flickered on and off, and people inside their homes reported that their TV reception was blotted out. As Chief Welland says, our switched-off loudspeakers crackled tremendously. At this point, some of the officers, including Chief Welland, chased one of the UFOs, and as he says, occasionally we saw them in the sky. After a few miles, the UFOs moved out of sight. Now later, it was discovered that the defense radar equipment at nearby Ramstein Air Force Base tracked the objects on radar for about a half hour. There were U.S. forces in the area, and when asked about the radar confirmation, a U.S. spokesman replied, "It's a military secret. We do not talk about this." But as Chief Welland says, "In my opinion, the talk about the UFOs was the gossip of cranks. But what I have seen on Friday evening near Messel makes me think, because there is no explanation for this phenomenon." Now this wave of sightings wasn't over yet. It was just 4 days later, another fleet of objects was seen all over Germany. Ursula Wiebers was on her balcony in Hamburg when she saw, quote, a light gray disc with a rainbow stripe appeared. On top of the disc were 2 antennae. Later, the Klar family in Aachen were watching TV when, quote, suddenly a bright beam of light filled our living room. We saw a bright disc in the sky. It was visible for 15 minutes, then it flew in the direction of Belgium. The day before yesterday, March 13, it appeared again. And there were more witnesses. Hugh Kruger and his friend described seeing, quote, 3 milk-white discs, which they said slowly moved in a shifting pattern from east to south. 2 other witnesses were Petra Rush and her friend Juanita, who were sitting in a car listening to the radio outside their parents' home in Urbensheim when an object flashed across the sky. And as Petra says, the streetlights flickered and the radio went down. Then just as abruptly as this wave began, it ended. The German press, which was notoriously skeptical of UFOs, covered it at length, and this is one of the very few cases in Germany at that time that received widespread publicity. How about that? It's funny to me that the police officers arrive on the scene and say, "Where's the little green man?" and then of course have to eat their words when they see the UFOs themselves. I doubt that this encounter would have gotten any coverage had it not been for the fact that 8 police officers became witnesses, and of course this object appeared on radar and all these weird electromagnetic effects. So yeah, a very dramatic close encounter of the second kind. Now we move to the last and final case of this collection. This one is probably my favorite because it's just so unusual. I call this one Guardians of the Earth. This one occurred on September 15, 1985 in Bagshot, England. This is a multiple witness case involving a husband and wife, and there were also outside witnesses. What's interesting about this case is what seemed to be a simple sighting actually resulted in what appears to be direct telepathic contact and also some really unusual physiological effects. So again, I'm not sure how you would categorize an encounter like this, but it's so fascinating because these were events that were ongoing for some time with this witness and was able to get some really interesting information from these alleged ETs. This case was investigated by prolific researcher Omar Fowler, who was chairman of SciGap, the Surrey Investigation Group, and was published in an article titled Close Encounter on Bagshot Heath in the Volume 31, Number 2 issue of the Flying Saucer Review. It's an incredibly strange multiple witness encounter with some truly bizarre after effects. It was around 9 p.m. on September 15, 1985, that David McMurray, a butcher, and his wife, Susan, a hairdresser, and their 2 small children, Paul, age 5, and Katie, age 18 months, were driving westbound along Red Road. This is Highway B311. The children were asleep in the back seat, and coming around a slight bend in the road, David and Susan were shocked to see an intensely bright object hovering over the road only about 150 feet ahead of them, and it was so bright that it was painful to look at. The object hovered just beneath some high-tension wires crossing the road, and as David says, "I saw something hovering above the road in front of us. I could not believe my eyes. It was a huge saucer-like craft with brilliant lights coming from portholes around the center." So as they drove closer to it, they could see that it was a 50-foot wide metallic object, was shaped kind of like a hockey puck, 5 feet high, with about 7 bright white round portholes. There was a blue-green light on the left side and a red light on the right. And as they got even closer, it shot up into the sky and disappeared, while at the same time a second craft appeared on the left side of their car and began to pace their vehicle. Meanwhile, the car which had been following behind them saw this whole thing and promptly pulled off to the side of the road. David, however, kept driving towards where a new housing development was being constructed, just in case he needed to run for help. Then he stopped the car and got out to observe this object that was still there. Susan, however, was too frightened to get out and instead remained in the seat and locked the door. But as Susan says, "I saw the 2 things with my own eyes. It was an incredible experience." Now, standing by his car, David saw the object hovering about 50 feet above the nearby trees. He was close enough to hear a buzzing noise, which he described as, quote, "like an electric sewing machine." He got a very strong feeling that the occupants of the craft were watching him closely. This face-off continued for about another minute or 2 when the object suddenly darted upward, became a star-like light high in the sky, and disappeared. So David got back in the car, turned it around, and drove back up to the top of the hill where they had first seen this object. The other car that had pulled over was still there. David did not stop to talk to them, something he would later regret, and instead they just continued home, and they immediately called the police, the Heathrow Airport, and the West Drayton Air Traffic Center to report the encounter. Then came the many strange after effects. The first is so bizarre. Everyone in the family overslept the next morning. Usually they were all up before 6 a.m., but on this morning they didn't awaken until 9:30 a.m. The next strange effect, when David went to start his car, the battery was completely dead. And the high strangeness just kept coming, because a few hours later, David developed a very severe headache that actually necessitated a visit to the hospital. They could find nothing wrong with him. But both David and his wife said that the day after the encounter, they both suffered from a, quote, hollow feeling, which was in their stomach, and, quote, shaky legs. These symptoms persisted for 3 days for Susan and 9 days for David. And as David says, the whole family was weak and trembling for days afterward. So this affected their kids too. David began having trouble sleeping. He started suffering weird memory lapses. He had an outbreak of small red circles on his body, each about 1 1/4 inch in diameter. They were on his neck, his left shoulder, and on his torso. One would appear and fade, at which point another would appear. They first appeared on the left side of his body, then after finally disappearing, they reappeared on the right side of his body, continuing for some 3 weeks after the initial encounter. And soon other witnesses to this event began to surface. Mr. and Mrs. Webb said that at 8:45 on that same night, about 15 minutes before the McMurrays' encounter, they were driving along the M4 towards Wokingham when they saw a bright red glowing object. As Mrs. Webb says, "I am sure it was not an aircraft. It made me think it could have been a so-called UFO." Other witnesses include Lynn Brooks and her boyfriend. At 11:45 that evening, some 2.5 hours after the McMurrays' sighting, they watched a strange object with red and white flashing lights for about 5 minutes, during which time their Great Dane was, quote, disturbed and whining. And as Lynn says, "I was really frightened. It was as if it was watching me." Meanwhile, David continued to have strange after effects. He started to develop a sudden and strong interest and perception of electronics and mechanics. For example, he would see a light switch and have a sudden knowledge about how it functioned. Once as he was driving his car, he said he was able to clearly visualize how the entire car engine worked. And then he started having out-of-body experiences. He woke up in the middle of the night to find himself floating above his body and looking down upon himself and his wife sleeping in bed. This happened twice, and he had never had an OBE before his encounter. And a final weird effect was this weird message that kept repeating in his head. The message was Epsilon 44L-47L. He had no idea what that meant. He'd never heard this word before. But epsilon is the 5th letter of the Greek alphabet. In mathematics, it signifies an extremely small quantity approaching 0. In astronomy, there is a star named Epsilon Eridani, which is located some 10.5 light years from Earth and is actually one of the closer stars to our own solar system. It reportedly does have an exoplanet, a gas giant orbiting it, which was discovered in the year 2000. And this is when scientists named that planet Epsilon b. But yeah, David says he had never heard this word before. Now, 1 month after the encounter on October 17, there was another incident. Joy Rapley and her 19-year-old daughter, June, saw a UFO from their home on Ambleside Road in Lightwater. And as June says, "I could see the shape of it, a dome shape, like a hat." Upon seeing it, Joyce thought to herself, "Good God, we are being invaded." Now, it was some months after the encounter that David McMurray finally decided to try hypnosis, mostly to find out the reason for this strange message about Epsilon that he could not get out of his head. Dr. Leonard Wilder placed David under hypnosis and regressed him back to his sighting. And under hypnosis, David stated that the beings began to communicate and called themselves, quote, Guardians of Earth. Now, the final contact happened on January 26, 1986. David was driving on the same road and had reached the same exact spot on this road where he had seen the UFO, and this is when he got a really bad headache. It was so bad he had to pull over to recover. Later, arriving home, David now began to write frantically, almost like automatic writing, because as his wife Susan says, he behaved as though he was in some sort of daze. Now, this message written by David apparently came from the ETs. It was a telepathic download. This was 1 page long, and it contained various bits of information. David wrote that the ETs said that they were friends of humanity and had been watching over Earth since at least 12 BC. They said that humankind had no significant development until the 19th century and are still divided about the idea of, quote, one supreme power. They also said that warlike activity will not be tolerated. They said that they came far away from Epsilon 44L-47L and were only contacting certain key people. David did go public with his encounter, but if he received any more messages, he has not revealed them. There you go. I think you'll agree that that is a very unusual case. How interesting is it that he went under hypnosis and did not recall going on board, but did recall this sort of telepathic communication with the ETs. And going back to that same location has this sort of second telepathic download, if you will, and does what we would call automatic writing and gets this very interesting message about who these ETs are, where they came from, and why they're here, and so forth. So it's an interesting case also because of all the outside witnesses and, of course, the weird physiological effects. All of these cases, I think, always raise more questions than they answer, but as we continue to grow our database of cases like these, one thing is certainly clear. They are real. There are far too many cases to explain away. As you can see, these cases are occurring all over the world, have been occurring for decade after decade. People are reporting the same sort of details. In other words, these cases are incredibly consistent, despite the fact that these people don't know each other. So that's very hard to explain away. I love these close encounters of the second kind. Again, I think that they provide some really interesting insights into the extraterrestrial presence on our planet. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I truly appreciate you guys tuning in, so thank you so much. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I hope to see you next time for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm signing out for now. Bye.